So welcome back, everybody. At this point, we have on our schedule item 4, presentations about monuments associated with oppression. And I'd like to introduce the chair for this session, Dr. William Bell, who is with, he's the board member, yes, ICOMOS Board of Trustees member, also former mayor of Birmingham, Alabama. And he was very much a mover behind the placement of the civil rights sites in the United States on the United States tentative list. So he's been very, very active in that regard. He's also someone who's been very, very concerned with the issue of monuments associated with repression in the United States, the Confederate monuments in particular. So I'm so happy that he's agreed to chair this session. And with that, I would turn it over to Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Mr. President, and greetings to each and every one of you. It's my distinct honor and pleasure as a member of U.S. ICOMOS to host this particular segment of our meeting this morning. You know, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome each and every one of you for a discussion about monuments of oppression around the world. We will have presentations from several distinguished professors and doctors from various parts of the world. Alpha Diop, who is a representative of ICOMOS in Mali, he will be presenting on monuments of oppressions in Africa. We have Sergiu Musteaţă. Hello, Sergiu, how are you? He is a professor and doctor in Moldova with concentrations in the area of South and Eastern Europe. We also have Leonardo Castriota from Brazil. Professor Castriota is a outstanding lecturer and educator in the area of cultural heritage in Latin America. And then we have Lilley. Dr. Lilley is a cultural heritage expert in Australia. And we look forward to hearing each and every one of these individuals make their presentations on monuments of oppression in their particular regions. I will begin, well, first of all, let me say after the presentation, we will open up for a question and answer period from any of you that may have questions concerning the presentation that we make. I'll begin first with monuments of oppressions here in the United States. If you would, please bring up the first slide. As you know, here in the U.S., we have a particular history of oppression as it relates to the slave trade and other areas of oppressions of minorities here in the United States. Slaves and indentured servants were originally brought here to the United States during the colonial period of the United States, prior to the formation of the government of the United States of America. Indentured servants were different from slaves. Usually that was brought about through a contractual relationship or an indebtedness that the indentured servant may have had to the principal. But it was purely a voluntary situation, and that was a time period in which the indentured servant could either buy their way out of their servitude or be granted permission to leave from that servitude once they've satisfied the debt. Slaves, on the other hand, were considered to be property. They were brought against their will to this country through various means, primarily through conflicts in Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and places like that. They were bought by Europeans and brought here to the Americas to act as slave labor. They had no control over their destiny. They had no voice in how long they would serve in the particular area of being a slave. And it was really, they were really viewed as not being human beings. Slaves, on the other hand, were also considered to be property, to be bought and sold like any other beast of burden. Slaves had no free will to terminate their bondage. After the Revolution and the founding of the United States of America, they were considered to be a vital component of the economic engine that created wealth in the newly founded country. Next slide, please. Many of the founding fathers were also slave owners. Next, please. Most prominently, you had, well, let's go back a couple of, I wanted to show the slide of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were two of the most prominent slaveholders during that period of time. Go to the next slide. By the mid-1800s, attitudes towards slavery and the ownership of human beings had changed. There was a great divide in the country, and slavery was one of the primary causes of the war between the states, commonly referred to as the Civil War. After the war had ended, slavery was abolished throughout the United States. But many of the southern states, next slide please, many of the southern states who were defeated in the war still harbored bitter feelings and continued to seek ways to oppress those former slaves who they saw as inferior. Next slide. As a result of that, at the end of the Civil War, Southerners named many cemeteries after fallen heroes of the lost cause of the Confederate War. And those cemeteries usually had some type of statue or monument to pay tribute to those individuals who were buried in those cemeteries. Next slide, please. Again, after the war, between the years of 1864 and 1870, there were 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. This Constitution is the governing document of the United States of America, and it was amended to do 3 things. The 13th Amendment was the official abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment provided the equal protection under the law for all native-born individuals and naturalized citizens. So if you were a slave born in the Americas during that period of time, you were granted your freedom as well as given equal protection as any other citizens, regardless of their race, creed, or color. The other amendment was the 15th Amendment that gave the right to vote to all male citizens. I say all male citizens because during that period of time, women were not allowed to vote. That did not occur until the early 1900s. Much of this was objected to by the southern states' congressional delegates. Over time, the southern delegates were able to erode the practical implementation of these amendments through states' rights arguments, which under our Constitution, states had various rights granted to them under their sole discretion. And many of these states established what was called Jim Crow laws. These laws were specifically designed to oppress minorities and offered strict criminal penalties for any violation of those so-called Jim Crow laws that were created by the southern states. These laws were specifically designed to intimidate African Americans, former slaves, and their descendants. It also helped, these laws also helped to erode and negate the practical effects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. In those state constitutions were both direct and indirect. Go back. Go back to the previous slide. In those state constitutions, go forward, one more slide. There we go, thank you. In those state constitutions were both direct and indirect propaganda of the delusional and invalid concept of white supremacy as part of the Ku Klux Klan, which was an organization founded by a former rebel Confederate leader named Nathan Bedford Forrest. This is a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that has been erected in one of the southern states. Forrest developed this organization specifically to intimidate former slaves and to keep them, quote unquote, in their place. They did this by a number of mechanisms, including hanging, lynching, dismemberment, and a number of other ways to set example towards individuals to not go against the Southern pride of white supremacy. There were organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy that went about the process of raising money to pay tribute to fallen soldiers of the Civil War. But it was also done to show that they had not forgotten that they were an oppressed society, wanting to continue to oppress African Americans who were former slaves in the communities. These statues were placed in prominent places all throughout the South as a reminder of white supremacy and the lost cause of the southern states, who saw themselves as being noble fighters seeking to protect the white race in the community. These organizations raised monies in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, to erect monuments that represented their doctrine of white supremacy and the lost cause of the Civil War. These Confederate monuments also served as a reminder to the newly freed former slaves and their descendants they were still in a subservient position in white Southern society. The first rounds of monuments were built and erected in the early 1900s. They were hailed as an outward expression and promotion of white supremacy and the Lost Cause Initiative that were reinforced by the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, during this period, the Klan was at its zenith in terms of its recognition and political power. Next, please. This is a slide showing a march on Washington that took place in 1926. It also demonstrated the political power that the Klan had. Now remember, this was initially a Southern organization strictly used to enforce those Jim Crow laws in the South. But because of the political strength that the Southerners had gained in Congress and in the White House during that period of time, the Klan became more prominent, even to the point that they held a march on Washington that brought thousands of Klansmen, not just from the South, but from all over the United States. The Confederate monuments that were placed throughout the South, and in some parts of the southwestern United States, were again there to intimidate and to let African Americans and former slaves know who was really still in charge. This period of time was called the Reconstruction period of the South, in which the South regained a lot of power and political clout here in the United States. Next slide, please. I added this picture, this slide, of the 1965 March on Washington that was led by Dr. Martin Luther King. During this period of time, Dr. King and others were pushing for human and civil rights for African Americans during this period of time. As a backlash, many of those organizations, such as the Daughters of the Confederacy and a number of other organizations, erected even more monuments in praise of the white supremacist ideology and the suppression of African Americans. But as you can see, when Dr. King put out the clarion call for individuals to come to Washington, they responded overwhelmingly. And when you contrast that with the pictures of the Klan in 1926, you see how the movement for civil and human rights had really grown during that period of time to suppress, well, not to suppress, but to uplift African Americans here in the United States. According to the American Historical Association, the erection of those monuments were intended in part to obscure terrorism that was being brought about by organizations such as the KKK and to intimidate African Americans politically and to isolate them in public life. You couldn't go to certain places, especially if they were flying the Confederate flag or had a monument to individuals such as Robert E. Lee or other individuals. Next slide, please. There were a round of construction of these monuments as a counter to the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. On the right of the screen that you're looking at is a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate general that led in the civil rights, in the Civil War, during the Civil War period of time. He was revered by all the Southerners, and they erected statues of Lee all throughout the South. It wasn't until just a few years ago that the statue on the left, which is a statue of Dr. Martin Luther King, was erected to show how far African Americans had come in terms of their human and civil rights. When you contrast these two monuments, you see the great divide that existed along racial lines in our community. But the progress of African Americans is still moving forward. About 4 or 5 months ago, there was a civil protest that developed around the killing of an African American in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mr. George Floyd. Out of that killing, protest arose, and from that, there was discussion about these monuments that were erected as monuments of oppressions for African Americans. Next slide, please. And there was a clarion call by protesters to start tearing down these monuments of oppression that represented hatred, that represented a past ideology, and salute to white supremacy. So these individuals who were protesting called for the demolition of these statues, or at least taking these statues out of the public square. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I thought I had one other slide, but it was a slide showing a statue of Robert E. Lee being taken down by a crane. This has sparked discussion all throughout the world of monuments of oppressions in various European places, Latin America, Africa, and throughout the world. To that end, I'd like to bring on Professor Alpha Diop, who is an expert in cultural heritage and with particular expertise in architecture as it relates to mosque. Dr. Diop, are you there?
Hello, morning. So, Aniche.
Hello there.
You understand that?
Yes, a little.
It's a remark. So, I'm greeting from Mali. Thank you very much. So, but I will speak in French. Merci beaucoup. Merci pour l'introduction. Et je voulais juste vous rappeler que le ICOMOS a créé un groupe de réflexion qui est en train de réfléchir et de travailler sur la décolonisation. Donc, tout ce qui est lié à la décolonisation et puis à la traite des Noirs, etc. Maintenant, et dans ce contexte, il y a déjà des activités qui ont été organisées au niveau d'ICOMOS, notamment un webinaire qui a été organisé le 19 juillet par le groupe de travail des professionnels émergents. Et également, il y a eu une activité qui a été organisée par ICOMOS Nigeria sur le même sujet. Donc, ce que je vais dire sera plutôt une contribution. Et je suis persuadé que les nouvelles activités avec le nouveau bureau qui va venir vont continuer à réfléchir et à travailler sur ce sujet qui est vraiment d'actualité, surtout après ce qui s'est passé aux États-Unis avec la mort de George Floyd. Merci de me donner cette occasion de parler par rapport au monument de l'oppression au niveau de l'Afrique. Next slide, please. Allô? Voilà. Merci. Donc, je le disais tantôt, les questions liées à l'esclavage, d'une manière générale, sont très sensibles et elles ont souvent déchaîné et continuent à déchaîner des passions. Et c'est pour cette raison que pour traiter ce sujet, on doit déjà l'aborder avec une grande largesse d'esprit, une grande ouverture d'esprit et accepter la différence et être tolérant. Next, please. Et il y a plusieurs formes de manifestation de l'oppression au niveau des monuments et de la culture d'une manière générale. William en parlait tout de suite. Il y a l'esclavage qui a beaucoup été pratiqué entre les différents continents et sur les différents continents. En Afrique, entre l'Afrique, l'Europe, l'Afrique, les États-Unis, l'Afrique, le monde arabe, etc. Et aussi dans d'autres pays, parce que ça avait plusieurs formes, ça avait le servage également. Il y a eu la colonisation qui a principalement été faite par les Occidentaux, l'Europe occidentale d'une manière générale, mais il y a d'autres types de colonisation dont on ne va pas parler ici. Il y a le racisme qui continue encore de nos jours. Et moi, je voulais aussi parler d'un aspect quand même assez important à mon avis, c'est l'aliénation culturelle. Cette aliénation culturelle est vraiment un phénomène qui est quand même récurrent et qui est toujours d'actualité aujourd'hui. Et ça prend plusieurs formes. Ça concerne la langue, par exemple, la langue que nous parlons. La langue que moi je suis en train de parler n'est pas ma langue. Nous avons nos langues. Et à force de pratiquer les langues des autres, nous finissons par appauvrir, entre griffes, nos langues nationales. Alors que les langues, ce sont des éléments de la culture. Donc ça aussi, on peut voir un peu comment la pression, l'oppression se fait à travers ces éléments. Il y a les méthodes d'apprentissage. Les méthodes traditionnelles d'apprentissage chez nous ont été plus ou moins abandonnées au profit du système que le colon nous a amené. Ça, c'est en Afrique en général. Et toutes les connaissances qui ont été acquises en dehors de ce circuit formel qui a été introduit par le monde ne sont presque pas reconnues. Et malheureusement, cela se ressent jusqu'au niveau des dossiers d'inscription. Parce que nulle part, dans les critères de sélection et d'inscription sur la liste du patrimoine mondial de l'UNESCO, on accepte les éléments liés à l'oralité ou à l'empirisme. Alors que nous, par exemple, traditionnellement, ceux qui construisent nos maisons, nos monuments, ils ont un apprentissage empirique. L'art culinaire, l'art vestimentaire, etc., etc. Next slide, please. On n'aura pas le temps de détailler tout ça. Maintenant, juste pour reconnaître que tous les monuments ont été érigés, soit pour célébrer ou célébrer les différentes formes d'oppression. Il y a beaucoup de lieux de mémoire. Ici, ça, c'est juste un élément de Ouida au Bénin, qui était également, avec Gorée, l'une des portes de sortie qui a servi énormément à la traite des esclaves. Il y a les statues des colons qui ont été réalisées. Excusez-moi, je vais éteindre quelque chose qui fait du bruit. Excuse-moi. Sorry for that, excusez-moi. Et donc, je disais qu'il y a également les éléments pour les statues qui ont été érigées, et William en a montré, donc je ne vais plus m'étaler sur ça. Mais il y a également un phénomène qui se passait ici dans les villes, c'est-à-dire entre les occupants, les colons et les autochtones, il y avait toujours une ségrégation. Et ça s'est vraiment révélé au grand jour, surtout en Afrique du Sud. Next, please. Et voilà. Donc, bien évidemment, chaque bien, c'est-à-dire chaque monument, a été créé par des groupes d'hommes, des communautés, soit en leur qualité d'acteurs, de témoins ou d'héritiers d'événements historiques. Et la situation géographique, le contexte général, ainsi que la période de l'histoire pendant laquelle ce monument est réalisé ont une importance capitale par rapport même au type de monument qui est réalisé et également sur la perception que les communautés et les citoyens ont par rapport à ces monuments. Donc, l'histoire, de mon point de vue, il n'y a pas de narration neutre. Il n'y a pas de narration neutre. L'histoire est racontée par celui qui gagne une guerre d'une manière et autrement par celui qui l'a perdue. Donc, ça, c'est des aspects subjectifs parce que l'humain n'est jamais vraiment parfait pour dire objectivement ce qui s'est passé. Il dit toujours, l'objectivité est toujours relative. Next, please. Nous n'aurons pas le temps de discuter de tous les aspects, mais moi, je voulais quand même soulever un point important ici qui fait partie, à mon avis, c'est aussi des éléments d'oppression. C'est-à-dire, pendant l'occupation, pendant la période coloniale, il y a eu beaucoup de biens qui ont été saisis et qui ont été volés parfois, arrachés de force parfois aux communautés, à leurs propriétaires, et qui ont été réutilisés en Europe. On a vu des monuments qui ont été pris en Égypte et qui sont dans des capitales en Europe à présent, aujourd'hui encore, qui n'ont pas été restitués. Est-ce qu'il faut restituer ces monuments aux communautés auxquelles elles appartiennent, aux communautés à laquelle les monuments appartiennent, ou est-ce qu'il faut même demander des compensations? Cette question de la compensation a été posée aussi bien pour les monuments, les objets d'art qui ont été pillés ou spoliés, qui se retrouvent dans des musées en Occident ou dans des collections privées, également par rapport même à la traite des Noirs à l'esclavage. Est-ce qu'il y aura une compensation? La question est posée. Donc, ce que je dis, nous posons aujourd'hui des questions parce qu'en 10 minutes, on ne peut vraiment pas épuiser ce sujet. Donc, on va juste nous contenter d'évoquer soulever des questions, mais probablement que dans l'avenir, il y aura l'opportunité de faire soit une conférence ou un colloque là-dessus. Next, please. Et je voulais aussi parler des outils de communication. Et je disais tantôt que chez nous, je constate qu'il y a vraiment une invasion de notre société par les médias. Les médias, les nouvelles technologies de l'information, que ce soit WhatsApp, YouTube, etc. Tout ce qui est vraiment, c'est des éléments qui sont très positifs, c'est-à-dire qui peuvent aider même à inventorier, à protéger et à éduquer. Donc, ce sont des outils qui sont très utiles, mais ces outils aussi peuvent être utilisés de façon négative. Il faut qu'on prenne garde à cela et qu'on ait conscience que ces outils peuvent être utilisés contre nous et ça peut être aussi utilisé comme un outil d'oppression. Je m'explique. Par exemple, au niveau de la culture, on est en train de nous envahir, pas forcément nous seuls, parce qu'on parle de globalisation, on parle de mondialisation, mais cette globalisation et cette mondialisation ne se fait pas toujours de façon équilibrée. Il y a très peu d'éléments de chez nous qui remontent et qui sont utilisés ailleurs. Par contre, les éléments qui viennent d'ailleurs nous sont imposés et sont en train de nous inonder dans tous les domaines de la culture, que ce soit la culture matérielle, c'est-à-dire que ce soit dans le domaine de l'architecture, dans le domaine culinaire, dans le domaine art visuel plastique, que ce soit dans le domaine de la musique. On a tendance même à ne plus utiliser nos instruments traditionnels de musique. Et je voulais juste dire qu'on devait faire attention et que ça, malgré le fait qu'il y a une démocratisation à travers ces outils modernes de communication, il faut qu'on fasse extrêmement attention pour qu'on ne subisse pas aussi les revers des éléments, des outils de communication modernes. Et pour terminer, je voulais juste faire une recommandation pour ICOMOS, parce qu'on est dans le cadre d'ICOMOS. Moi, je voulais proposer qu'on travaille ensemble, tous ensemble, au changement des mentalités, en favorisant la diversité. Next, please. Next slide, please. Voilà. En favorisant la diversité, l'équité et l'inclusion au sein des instances d'ICOMOS. Et pour atteindre ce changement de mentalité, il faut se dire que nous sommes dans un processus pédagogique continu, dont l'atteinte nécessite certains préalables, parmi lesquels le respect et l'écoute de l'autre. Tant qu'on ne peut pas écouter les autres, c'est très difficile même de les apprécier et de pouvoir les mettre au niveau où ils devraient être. Et respecter l'autre, ça veut dire que l'autre, il faut éviter d'avoir des préjugés et de dire à l'avance que non, tout ce que celui-là avance est négatif. Et ça, c'est des clichés. Je pense que globalement, on retrouve ça dans les médias. Dans les médias, lorsque on est surtout en Occident, chaque fois qu'on vient parler de l'Afrique, c'est toujours des phénomènes négatifs. Soit c'est la guerre, soit c'est la famine. Mais si on fait de nouvelles choses, de belles choses ici, c'est très, 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 très rare de pouvoir trouver ça sur les médias en Occident. Ce n'est pas qu'en Occident, mais peut-être l'inverse aussi est possible. Et l'autre chose, c'est aussi de reconnaître ses propres limites et se dire qu'on ne sait pas tout. Aucun être humain ne peut tout savoir pour lui-même et par lui-même. Et aucun être humain ne peut être compétent dans tous les domaines. Ça veut dire qu'il faut ici encore cultiver la tolérance et accepter que chacun, au niveau d'ICOMOS, par exemple, peut apporter quelque chose et que notre différence doit être notre richesse. Et il y a un autre phénomène, c'est le courage de se remettre en cause. Ce n'est pas parce qu'on a un acquis aujourd'hui qu'on doit s'arrêter à cet acquis et ne pas vouloir se poser des questions pour avancer. Et le dernier élément, à mon avis, c'est la critique et l'autocritique. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut accepter qu'on puisse être critiqué pour ce qu'on propose ou ce qu'on fait et également accepter de se critiquer soi-même par rapport à l'évolution même de l'humanité, à l'évolution même de la personne humaine, à l'évolution même de son vécu quotidien et de son vécu d'une manière générale au sein de notre grande société. Next, please. Et je vous remercie. Je vais vous dire merci en Bambara, Auniche. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diop. We appreciate that enlightened presentation. Next, we have Sergiu Musteaţă of Moldova. Dr. Musteaţă is an expert in the cultural heritage of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. His particular expertise centers around understanding dictatorships under the communist government regime. He's done extensive writing and presentation through the university there. So at this time, I would like to bring up Dr. Sergiu Musteaţă.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Everything is okay. Laura, could you please start my presentation? Yes, thank you so much. So a little bit different topic, which is specific for post-Soviet area. So I will try to draw your attention for the couple of next couple of minutes on situation in Moldova. But of course, it is related to most of the Soviet countries or post-Soviet republic, and especially nowadays situation in Ukraine, or 2-3 decades ago, what it was happening in Baltic states or in other post-Soviet countries. So situation in Moldova at the beginning, or let's say at the end of Soviet Union, as a result of collapse, the Moldovan parliament decided, of course, not just to stop the activity of the Communist Party, which was prohibited in 1991 as a result of collapse of Soviet Union, but also declaration of independence. But anyway, a few years later, they changed the rules and give the opportunity to reopen the Communist Party in Moldova, and they succeed to come back to the power in 2001. So, but this is another part of the story. Exactly on the same time, next slide, please. The parliament, as a result of this situation in August 1991, decided to, so I'll try to cite exactly from the decision, liquidation of the monument and other communist ideology attributes. So now, of course, we could discuss about the title, but also the decision, liquidation. It's right or it's not right word for the totalitarian regime monuments. I think it was too fast decision, and they didn't follow the implementation of the decision, because the most part of the biggest part of the monuments related to the Soviet time still today are on the main squares in different cities and villages in Moldova. So actually the decision from August 25 in 1991 referred to the most important part of, let's say, of the capital, of the Chisinau, and they just removed the monument of Lenin from the main square to somewhere at the margin of the city, which is still today staying there, and the communist members going and visiting the monument. Some of the monuments replaced from the main squares to the private houses, and you could see a few pictures here of the situation of the monument of Lenin. But of course, it's not just related to the Lenin, also different other, next slide please, and other monuments in Moldova. And as I mentioned, please next slide. As I mentioned, the Communist Party returned to the power in 2001, and they actually ruled the country 8 years. And during this period of time, of course, they tried to protect, preserve communist monuments in some cities and villages. The local authorities is, of course, supported by the central government and the president of Moldova at that time from the former communist leader. They reopened the monuments, and they encouraged to reopen the monuments of Lenin or other communist monuments in Moldova. And in 2008, under Parliament, under the Commission of the Culture and Heritage and Education and so on, they tried to give an official preservation status of different monuments from the Soviet time, which still exist in Moldova, but to cover them or to try to protect them, because still today in Moldova, it's a contradictory issue to talk about the monuments of the communist regime. So we didn't replace in other parts from the main square to the other parts of the city like it was in Baltic states. They created open air museum. In Moldova, I think because of the Communist Party returned to the power, but also because a huge part of society is still supporting, let's say, this communist ideology, or it's very much influenced by the communist ideology, still supporting the monuments. And when part of society, especially civil society, asking to remove some monuments from the important parts of the city, especially in the capital, to other parts, this part of inhabitants reacting very negatively and trying to protect the communist monuments. Please, next slide. In 2010, it was a very specific political situation. Actually, the president of parliament at that time was officially representing the president, because they didn't succeed to elect the next president, and it was a leader of the Liberal Party, and he decided to create a truth commission in Moldova for the first time, just in 2010, actually after 20 years of our independence. So not immediately like it's happened in other post-Soviet or post-socialist countries, but just in 2010, I was one of the deputy chair of this commission. So it was not so easy to work. It was very huge pressure. But we try to discuss also about the future of the monument, of the legacy and so on. So we did a huge report, including some recommendations and of course conclusion related to the monuments, how to treat them, how to try to preserve, but to remove them from the main squares in the cities, and to try to discuss about the role of the monuments as part of the museum, as part of our recent past, and to try to involve community to participate, but not to provoke the conflicts, because in some cases it was a really conflict situation in different villages. So next slide, please. During our activity in the commission, and when we try to discuss about the communist crimes, about the symbols, and about many other aspects, about the deportations, or about collectivization, or many other aspects of the communist regime, a part of society is, of course, provoked and supported by the Communist Party. And you could see some young people, I'm not sure if they understood exactly what they are doing, but anyway, they protest against our activity in the commission and trying to say that anti-communism, it's a fascism. So was not so easy to talk to them. So you could see the pictures of the Moldovan political leaders, but of the fascist elements, so of the Nazi elements, let's say. So another part of society, of course, next slide, please, try to say that we have to talk about our recent past and to understand that it was occupation regime, and also it was not so easy during the communist past, especially during the beginning or couple of years, beginning of the period of Soviet period. So the liberal leaders tried to place a commemorative stone, so-called, they planned to build a new monument in the main square in Chisinau in front of the government building. And you could see here just a picture of the stone, which is dedicated to the victims of the communist regime, which is, I think, okay, because exactly on this place, it was a monument of Lenin in Chisinau until 1991. But anyway, this decision of the ad interim president of Moldova was contested by the Communist Party, by many leaders, but also to support local communists, it was the Russian State Duma reacted and condemned the president's decision. So you see what Russia is doing and trying to react to some decision in total different independent country. Of course, some deputies, Russian deputies arrived in Chisinau. They tried to do some meetings with the local political leaders and also the population. Anyway, this decision was actually declared illegal by Constitutional Court because it's against something, I don't know, because Occupation Day was not occupation. So you see, the Soviet army didn't occupy Bessarabia in 1940. And when we are talking about this situation of our actually recent past, it's not so easy because the society still today is dominated by this Soviet ideology, and I think half of society considering that Soviets liberate Moldova or liberate Bessarabia in 1940, and of course it should be as official discourse, which is always a very sensitive issue. So the next decision, I think, if you look in the national legal framework, we could see that different other law actually mentioning that the Soviet regime was totalitarian regime, Soviet army occupied Bessarabia, but when it was decided just to officially to recognize that the June 28th of 1940 is Occupation Day, like it was agreed in Baltic states, so in Moldova it doesn't work. Next slide, please. So around this, let's say, place of commemoration, the victims of the regime, totalitarian regime, another part of society, as I mentioned, reacted very negatively. And for example, the Russian Youth League, they protested about against the decision and tried to say that if the leaders, liberal leaders or right party leaders or the democratic leaders will not remove this stone, a symbol of commemoration of the communist victims, they will destroy it. And also at that time, other political leaders, left parties leaders, also condemned, and they decided this is not commemoration stone, but this is shame stone, and it should be removed from the main square. They didn't succeed, and still today the stone it's there. But anyway, the democratic parties also didn't succeed to do a real project of the victims of the communist regime and to commemorate. Another monument, it's about victims of deportations, Soviet deportations from 1949, especially the huge wave, and many thousands of families were deported from Moldova to Siberia or to Kazakhstan. And this monument is actually new one, the second picture from the down part. So the city hall succeed to build this monument 15 years ago, but it was a long and very difficult process, and they succeed to place the monument in front of the railway station, because from the railway station, Chisinau railway station, the most of families by the train moved to from Moldova to Kazakhstan or Siberia. So it's very symbolic place. But anyway, this monument is not uniting the people. You could see 6th of July, the day of deportation, the political leaders are not coming. So the right parties are coming to commemorate the victims. The left parties are not coming. And the pro-Russian, especially, people are not considering the deportation as part of our past. And this is not recognized because during the Soviet time, it was hidden part of our history. So next slide, please. In this situation, I think we have to try to analyze the general state of society. And half of Moldovan society is still today considering that my homeland is Moldova, but another part of society is still living in the Soviet Union. And they are saying my homeland is Soviet Union. And you could see just 10 years ago pictures, 9th of May, so-called the Victory Day. Usually around this day, society is divided because part of society, especially the young generation, are celebrating 9th of May as European Day, as, let's say, Democracy Day, but another part of society still celebrating the Victory Day like it is doing Russia, especially during the last 10, 15 years. And next slide, please. And I think, and this is another part of Moldovan reality, let's say third part of population considering that Bessarabia, this is a Romanian land because it was part of Romania during the interwar period, but another part of society, especially pro-Russian or Russian speakers supported by the left parties, are considering that Moldova, this is the Russian land and it should be part of Russia. And you know, I think very well that we have Transnistria, this separatist region controlled by separatist authorities, supported by Russia. And I think this propaganda is coming also through Transnistria. But next slide, please. But in most of the cases, I think situation in Moldova, or this situation in Moldova, it's a result not just of nostalgia. Nostalgia, it's a characteristic, it is part of our, let's say, collective mentality, but I think that this conflict situation, it's still today result of the Russian propaganda, because Moldovan media are very, let's say, dominated by the Russian discourse. You could see a lot of the Russian broadcasts, radio stations, and also TV broadcasts, and you could see different surveys. This is just an example 9 years ago, but still today, more than 35, around 40% of people who are participating in this survey regretting collapse of Soviet Union and still considering that Soviet system was the best one, and they would like to come back. So this is, I think it's a huge problem. The next slide, and that's why the discussions about the Soviet monuments. So you could see the example of different leaders from the Soviet time, not just Lenin, but also we have some local leaders like Kotovsky or like Sergei Lazo, another Soviet leader, still today staying in Chisinau in different squares. And when we are trying to discuss about replacing, this is actually opening the conflict. It's like a frozen conflict inside of society. And it's at the moment, I think we do not have a real strategy dealing with these monuments, which of course are part of our history, but some people, and I think part of society, considering that they are not representing nowadays Moldova, and that's why this kind of monuments have to be removed to different museums or open air museum outside of the city. And we have just a few years ago, a private guy opened outside of the city a museum like in Vilnius or like in different other Baltic states, and trying to collect the Soviet monuments in a private museum, let's say. We will see how it's going on, but as we cannot develop a really open mind society and to try to critically analyze the Soviet times, until this time, I think the society will be dominated by this Soviet discourse. And the last slide, please, I think it's like a conclusion. Officially, Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. Could you press once again? Yeah. But situation in Moldova is a specific one. We could move Republic of Moldova from the Soviet Union, but I think that the biggest and the most important problem, how to move Soviet Union from the Republic of Moldova. from the mentality of people and try to understand that we are already for 3 decades independent, and we have to build our independent country and try to have our own symbols and values, which should be based democratic society. But you know, propaganda and Russian interest in the region and pro-Russian speakers are too much supporting the Soviet values, and situation it's still in conflict. We hope in the near future probably the young generation will treat a little bit different the Soviet past and the Soviet legacy. Thank you so much. But it's a sensitive issue.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Musteaţă. We could have an hour-long conversation just on Russian propaganda alone. You know, it's very prominent in the news here in the U.S. So we appreciate your enlightening us on this concern in Moldova. Next, we have Leonardo Castriota. Dr. Castriota is from Brazil, and he's going to talk to us about monuments of oppression in Latin America. Dr. Castriota, and I apologize if I mess up anyone's name. So, Dr. Castriota.
Hello, William. Hello, William.
Yes.
Buenos dias a todos e todas. Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to tell of my satisfaction in sharing some ideas on this very important topic about the monuments linked to oppression. I'd like to thank William and Alpha and Sergiu for the very important presentations. I think they've raised very, very important topics. And I'll talk, about from the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. But I will allow myself to begin by referring to an author that I consider of the highest importance, Louis Wrigley, who was the general conservator of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And he presents us at the beginning of the 20th century with a very, very important ideas and a central distinction that in my mind are central to discuss the battle that's now being fought over monuments around the world. Next, please. The first distinction that he draws is between intentional and unintentional monuments. I think this distinction is central. He points that the monuments in the strict sense were erected to commemorate an event, and unintentional monuments were objects that were later chosen to be monuments and to which we attribute value, we ascribe value afterwards. Next, please. And I would like also to draw attention to 3 very, very central ideas that I'll refer again in the end of my presentation. The first one is that monuments and historical monuments, they have a different relation to temporality. That's to say, they presuppose different conservation attitudes. Second, that we should distinguish in each case the values that are at stake. And third, and most important, that the conservation itself should be regarded as historically determined. Next, please. Turning now, to the proposed theme. We all know that the movement, that with the Black Lives Matter movement, we see everywhere, the destruction, the demolition of statues, monuments of characters, especially associated with slavery, colonialism, and racism. If this happens all over the world this year, I would like to draw attention to the fact that in Latin America, we have a similar movement that began earlier. In 2019, we have this same movement in Latin America. Next, please. In the case of Latin America, next, please. In the case of Latin America, I think it's worth noting that at least since 2015, we have been living through a strong social and political crisis. After more than a decade of relative instability, our continent, whose history has been marked by instability and the recurrent attacks on democracy, seemed to live a stable period with successive elected governments and with a relative economic success. Next, please. It seemed that we were finally going to achieve a fairer social situation and a higher and most important, a more sustainable degree of development. Next, please. What happened, however, since 2015 frustrated us. Both our economies proved to be weaker than we thought, and the very democratic system of our countries came under a coordinated attack. Next, please. Thus, there are coups d'etats, which we thought we had already overcome. First in Guatemala in 2015, then in Paraguay, in Brazil, and finally in Bolivia. Next, please. Social uneasy also grows, and the street demonstrations respond, sometimes violently, to government policies. Institutions and heritage policies are weakened throughout the region. It's interesting that in Chile, in October 2019, it begins a series of protests against the neoliberal policies that were being applied by government for a long time. Next, please. We see all over the world very, very impressive images that come from Chile. Next, please. Sometimes, with violence. Next, please. But the important thing, next, please, it's important to stress that the institutions and heritage policies are weakened throughout the region. In addition to these obvious impacts that demonstrations have on heritage, an important point is raised by Salazar, a Latin American intellectual, that points out that this movement is also on heritage and on the right to memory. He says, somehow, what this movement claims is the definition and selection of what deserves to be remembered and what does not. Next, please. So in Chile, it's interesting to note that between October 2019 and February 2020, 1,353 damaged monuments have been registered all over the countries. Next, please. It's also interesting to notice that the main focus of the attack, of sometimes this resignification of the meaning of these monuments, are some signs of the Hispanic conquest, but also some periods of the Republican history of Chile. Next, please. All over the country, the monuments become platforms to transmit messages against the government, against oppression, against the new liberal policies, but for a fairer social reality and for the right to retell their history. Next, please. I'm having a problem with my cat. She's here and she wants to participate. In many cases, monuments are attacked, destroyed, and sometimes replaced by statues that refer to another history, to oppressed groups of national history. Here you can see a Spanish conqueror statue. It was demolished, it was toppled, and was to be substituted by a statue of an Indian woman that is symbol of the resistance. Next, please. So, but there's another coin of this, there's another side of this coin, the coin, there's another side of this history. If we relate sometimes the struggle that is fought on the memory to popular demonstrations and the replacement of statues, another type of struggle around memory also takes place in our continent. I refer here to the action taken by the state and by state agencies in relation to symbols and heritage, which reflect the intense dispute on memory that takes place in our continent, in our times. This struggle is not only about conflicting political views, but we have also significant religious and ethnic dimensions. I have 3 examples here in this regard. The first takes place in Bolivia, where the Huipala, the indigenous national flag that characterizes the progressive government that has existed in that country for more than 10 years, will be violently attacked when the coup d'etat takes place. In their place, in the place of the Ipala, the new dominant groups, many of them religious fundamentalists, point to the Bible, which should indicate the dominance of the Christians and of the white men, the white people, over a multiracial state. Next, please. In the case of Brazil, the religious dimension also appears with great force, with an important role played by the new evangelical groups, which have achieved a strong political power in recent years. Here, on this image, you can see it's not a rabbi, but an evangelical bishop that is the leader of a political group, one of these churches, and of a political group that governs, for example, the city of Rio de Janeiro. Next, please. Based on a narrative about the end of the world, when they believe they will convert Jews to the Christian faith, these groups appropriated Jewish signs. As you can see, the evangelical bishop dresses as a rabbi. In addition, they choose as their opponent the African Brazilian culture. Here you can see the Valongo Pier, a recently discovered port in Rio de Janeiro, where approximately 1 million Africans have arrived enslaved for over 200 years. In 2015, as a symbol of the Atlantic traffic, the site was included in the list of the World Heritage Site. Using the categories, it's very important as of sensitive heritage. However, the Brazilian government and the local government of Rio de Janeiro have not taken any action to protect the site, not even to interpret it, not even installing the reference center that would house the more than 50,000 archaeological items that were found here in this very, very important spot for our history and our memory. Next, please. One last example will be a violent intervention that suffers the cultural landscape of Rio de Janeiro, also included in the World Heritage Site in the category of cultural landscape. In this case, the local government, commanded by a new evangelical bishop, has erected a monument to the Jewish Holocaust, a monument of more than 20 meters at the top of one of the most important hills in this landscape, strongly affecting our perception of the cultural landscape. And the worst, next please. The mountain had all its vegetation that was constituted of tropical forest removed. In its place, olive trees are planted, so that in their mind, this place will resemble the Mount of Olives in Palestine, and so that it will become a pilgrimage point for the new evangelicals. Here you can see examples of the state building new monuments to the groups that are now in power. Next, please. Well, to conclude, I come back to the ideas that I presented at the beginning, to the three ideas that I distinguished in the Denkmalkultus by Alois Wrigley. And first of all, when we see that monuments and historical monuments, they belong to different temporality regimes, we should consider that monuments in the strict sense are in their core political, and they will exist till the dominant groups that erected them are sometimes in power. So they can be displaced, they can be destroyed according to the political struggle. But we should consider that they also have, as historical monuments, a historical dimension that should be preserved. In this way, we should, as Wrigley points out at the beginning of the 20th century, for each decision, we should distinguish what values are at stake in each case. And we should consider primarily and especially that conservation itself is historically determined. So we should be very cautious about abolishing monuments. In my mind, in my opinion, we should sometimes, we have to destroy the monuments, but mainly we should reinterpret them. Next, please. And to close, I bring this example that I find a very good solution. It's a small monument in Berlin that was commissioned by the East German government in 1981 to commemorate a resistance group that was led by a young Jewish boy. His name is Herbert Baum. And when they erected this monument under the communist regime, they wanted to emphasize that this group belonged to the Communist Party. So it's a kind of commemoration of the communist regime. Well, after the reunification of Germany, they did not destroy this monument. They resignified it. They added another layer. They put, as you can see, a plate of glass in which they added the names of the other people that were murdered in this attempt of resistance against the Nazi regime. And they wrote, this legend that in a certain way summarizes what I'm trying to convey. They say, to this day, this memorial stone documents the courageous resistance action of 1942, the understanding of history in 1981, and our enduring commemoration of the resistance against the Nazi regime. They respected all layers of history. Next, please, and final one. As a political assertion, as a political a gesture, the monuments can sometimes provoke anger in us. We can comprehend that. It's very understandable. But I think we should also research to our imagination so that we can, as heritage professionals, reinterpret monuments so that we can retell the stories without erasing any layer. Thank you very much.
See, can you hear me now? Thank you, Leonardo. As I was saying, I'm just blown away by the quality of the presentation that's being made and the outstanding academic credentials that each one of you have. And our last speaker is no less brilliant than our previous speakers in terms of his work in the area of cultural heritage, archaeology, and a number of other areas of educational enlightenment. And that's Ian Lilley from Australia. Professor Lilley, as I said, is a forward-thinking individual in the area of archaeology and the preservation of cultural heritage. And at this time, we'd like to bring on Dr. Lilley. Dr. Lilley?
Thank you, everyone. It's after midnight here, so I'll keep this relatively brief. I'm going to share my screen and do my own slides. But thank you for inviting me to be a presenter. This one here. Hello, there we go. Okay, my French isn't good enough to do this orally, so I'll present in English and have the PowerPoint in French. Certain people might say that Australia itself is a monument to oppression. It was founded on the brutal oppression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people a couple of hundred years ago. It was initially built by convicts who were kept in appallingly oppressive conditions, which today are commemorated, I have to say, as a serial World Heritage Site. And it's also, a lot of people don't know, it's included the oppression of South Sea Islanders, as we call them, or Pacific Islanders, who were brought to Australia by people colloquially called blackbirders. They were brought to work on sugarcane plantations in my state and cotton plantations, much as they were in the Americas, often by the same people. As an example, my university is in a suburb called St. Lucia, named after the Caribbean island of St. Lucia by a person who moved from one to the other and established a sugarcane plantation where my university is now located. Now, these Pacific Islanders were brought over technically as indentured labour, but were very often forced to work in slave-like conditions. So we have a history of very brutal oppression, both of native peoples brought from other places, and the convicts who initially built the European colony. Of course, however, we've got what we might call monuments of oppression from the colonial period. Most of them are explorers, mainly British, but also including the Dutch and the Spanish and the French and various others, important colonial people and so on. Some of these statues recognise or commemorate people who, quite often on the statue itself will say something like killed by the savage blacks, because they never ever mention why those people may have been killed, for example, for stealing land, violating women, destroying resources. Nor do they mention the massacres that usually followed in reprisal after some Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Island people may have killed some European settlers. There was almost always shocking massacres in reprisal. Okay, something's stuck in my way, excuse me. Now, of course, occasionally we see people attempting to deface or otherwise destroy some of these monuments. Most recently, these attempts were coincidental with the Black Lives Matter movement that erupted, or the latest spike in the Black Lives Matter movement, which erupted around the world. And here we have an example of James Cook, Lieutenant James Cook, as he was when he was the first Briton to come to the east coast of Australia. You can see people have spray painted "No Pride in Genocide" and changed the date. Change the date refers to the date of what they call Australia Day, the foundation of the British colony in 1788. And Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders, are quite often concerned to call it something else or change the day. Now you can see on the right-hand side that same statue surrounded by mounted police and other police during the Australian version of the Black Lives Matter protests. It was just recent. You can see the police are all wearing masks. So we do have these sorts of things. By and large, however, not a lot of attention is paid to these sorts of historical monuments. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. One is that they are colonial, and it's a period which most of us in this audience are probably quite familiar with, but for the mass of Australians, they have less and less relevance, and that's partly because of the mass international migration since the Second World War, and particularly since the 1970s, after the end of what was called the White Australia policy, when it was virtually impossible for anyone outside Western Europe, and particularly from Britain or Ireland, to migrate to Australia. Since 1975, migration has seen the Australian population double to 25 million. So since I started university, the Australian population has doubled from people from all over the world. And they have very little connection, for the most part, to the earlier colonial period. Now, most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Australians, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the Indigenous scene in Australia, the mainland of Australia and Tasmania was inhabited by people we now gloss as Aboriginal people, but there's a group of 200 odd small islands between Northern Australia and the island of New Guinea, which these days is politically part of Australia, and Torres Strait Islanders count as native Australians. Now, native Australians are generally speaking offended by the colonial statues that exist, but most of them are actually much more preoccupied by urgent matters such as poverty, health, education, vastly disproportionate rates of incarceration, imprisonment, and vastly disproportionate deaths in custody. Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people represent about 2% of the Australian population nationally and about 30% of the prison population. These sorts of life and death, literally life and death matters, are generally speaking of much more concern to Indigenous Australians than the occasional statue of Captain Cook, or Lieutenant Cook as he was. Another reason, which is one I want to pursue, taking a slightly different angle from the other papers, is that what we might call the statue landscape of Australia is almost completely dominated by war monuments, particularly relating to the First World War, but also including more recent conflicts in which we've been involved. Afghanistan, for example. We've been involved in just about everybody's war everywhere. I think I heard on the radio this morning that we've had Australian service members at war every day of the year since 1947, first for the Brits and most recently with the Americans. But also these statues quite often these days include other colonial conflicts in which colonial Australians were involved. The Sudan, for example, what was quite often called the Boer War, the I forget what it was called. Anyway, the war in South Africa. And so these sorts of monuments, and I'll show some slides in a minute, just utterly dominate the Australian statue landscape. Now, the statue landscape, these World War I and other war monuments have quite severe problems. For example, all of the First World War statues traditionally were white colonial males. In the war statue landscape more generally, there is no representation of what we'd call the frontier wars, the wars between colonial settlers and Indigenous Australians. Despite the fact that they commemorate other colonial wars, there's a very strong feeling against including wars on the mainland and in the Torres Strait and in Tasmania against Aboriginal people. Interestingly, despite those problems, Australian Indigenous people are mainly, not all, but mainly interested in or strongly interested in having their war service recognised after a century or more of denial of that service by mainstream Australia, and also the appallingly bad treatment of native veterans, Aboriginal Torres Strait Island veterans, by non-Indigenous Australians. For example, I'll talk about some specific in a minute, but they were quite often treated to levels of equality in the military that they just simply didn't receive before they joined the military, but to which they were denied after the war ended. So they weren't allowed to join veteran associations and so on. So people are, in general, in my experience, over the last quarter of a century working in Indigenous organisations, they're much more concerned with having their war service recognised in the Australian statue landscape than they are in pulling down statues. Excuse me, this little black box keeps appearing on the middle of my text. Now, this effort by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Australians to celebrate their part in what we might broadly call the Anzac legend is a very powerful subversion of an otherwise omnipresent, widespread symbol of oppression lasting hundreds of years by colonial Australians of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. And I hope I give you an impression, as I'll show you in a minute, that this casts a quite different light on what might otherwise be seen as monuments associated with oppression. Aboriginal people are in fact taking ownership in many ways of the symbol of that has hitherto oppressed them. So I'll show you some slides and discuss them. As I said, I'll keep it brief because I'm getting very tired. So here we have some I can actually get rid of that. Some statues. The one in the middle, this white one here, is the kind of statue that is everywhere. In the smallest town in Australia, there will be a monument like this, a World War I Australian soldier the list of dead, of which there were multitudes. Australia had the highest rate of loss per capita in the First World War, certainly on the Allied side. Basically, an entire generation or so of Australian males was just removed from the population. And these statues were brought in very soon after the war, in fact, and I think possibly even before it finished, but they're ubiquitous in the Australian landscape. This is the most common form, but there are other kinds here. This one with the donkey, very famous Australian mythologized story of a man called Simpson, who wouldn't fight but carried men out of the conflict on a donkey at our most, what's the word, celebrated action in World War I, which had massive defeat at Gallipoli, when people were just slaughtered. That's the most common sort. Quite often, sometimes we have ones like this one over here on the left, which is much smaller. It's a man on a horse from the Anglo-African War, the Boer War. This one on the right, the larger photo, is the Australian War Memorial. Until very recently, it had no specific recognition of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Island people, certainly not the frontier wars, and that's a continuing sore point. In fact, there's news this morning on the radio, national radio, about the redevelopment of part of the War Memorial, and it's quite a controversial issue. Interestingly, however, as was quite common at the time when that War Memorial was built, Aboriginal people were represented there, as you can see by this gargoyle below the main picture, but they were represented along with the flora and fauna, as they were quite often treated at that time. That gargoyle has been removed, not because it's racist, but because there was some issue with asbestos in the building. But the gargoyle might have been removed, but there's no sign that there'll be any recognition of colonial frontier wars, even though other colonial wars, such as the Sudan, are represented there. So it's a bit of a sore point. However, as I said, interestingly, Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islands are taking matters into their own hands and, in a sense, forcing their representation. Sometimes it's through specific additions to statues like this middle one here. Sometimes it's ones like this here. This is a rock painted with traditional paintings down not very far from where I live, in fact, on what we call the Gold Coast, a bit like Australia's Miami. And this plate here says, remembering the Aboriginal people who served in the Australian forces. It's quite important to people that they have that service recognised, because every day on April the 25th, Australia stops for what's called Anzac Day, in which military service to the nation is commemorated. Over recent years, it started to incorporate service people from other nationalities rather than just Anglo-Australians, migrants, in other words, and increasingly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. They're getting a higher profile more generally, in fact, both through their own efforts and through the efforts of supporters. One would be, if we look on the bottom black and white photo, this statue here, the man at the back with his arm in the air is an Aboriginal man dancing. That thing there is actually a Torres Strait Island man's head with a special headdress called a dari on it. So there's traditional people in the background, and then there's a pilot in the middle, and then someone ascending to heaven with little wings on the back as an angel. Now, I think that statue was produced, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, by an Indigenous artist. And I think this pilot in the middle here is actually this chap here, who is Australia's Aboriginal, World War II Aboriginal fighter ace. He was the only one we had. We had lots of Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people serve in the military in World War II, but Len Waters was the only fighter ace. And it was quite a tragic story, recently published in a book by Peter Rees, who I advised on the book. And after helping the veterans organisation, after a very, very long period of denial, get Len Waters' wife a war pension, Peter Rees wrote this book, which told the story of Len's rise to to prominence in the services, but also the tragic tale after he returned to Australia, and having been lauded as a flying ace through the war, had to return essentially to the Aboriginal reserve. He wasn't allowed to drink like any other Aboriginal person. He wasn't allowed to vote. He wasn't allowed to participate in society in the same way that he'd been able to briefly in the military. So we can gradually see this change in attitude to service, and it's being driven largely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people themselves. And as I said, upending or undermining these ubiquitous statues, which until very recently were a definite sign of their oppression by non-Indigenous Australia. So on that note, I'll stop and thank you for listening and stop sharing and go back to the main screen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lilley, for that presentation. I apologize. We've run over a little bit on our time, but I was so enraptured in the comments of all of our speakers. The time just got away from me there. But in looking at some of the comments from people who are on the Zoom link, several things popped out. And it goes back to something that Dr. Diop said. Really, each one of you said it in your own way. Dr. Diop had one slide that said, a view from the oppressor versus the oppressed. And when it comes down to monuments, that's really what it's all about. How do you perceive it, and from what perspective do you perceive that monument? Does it represent history, or does it represent ideology? Does it represent pride, or does it represent pain? And how do we, and I'm throwing this out there for each one of you, how do we have the dialogue to determine how a monument should be presented, how all sides should have input as to what that monument represents? And should it be part of our history? Should it be taken down and ignored? Or how should we approach that? Dr. Lilley, since I have you on the screen, why don't you take a shot at it?
Thank you, William. I'm a person who thinks that much like the statue that we were shown in, or the installation we were shown in Berlin, I actually think we should preserve most of these statues, but provide additional context, which sets them in their historical place, shows what we may or may not think of them now, and generally acknowledges their what they represent for all parties. I can understand, however, the feelings of my, for example, in Australia, Indigenous colleagues who would like them all melted down and turned into something useful. But I, as an archaeologist and a heritage person and so on, I do think that they're there, that they can actually be a powerful educational tool, and as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island service members have shown here, can also be used to reverse the picture in a quite dramatic way, and place Aboriginal people or other oppressed people in the centre of the story rather than not in the story or only on the edge of the story. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do.
Sergio, are you there? I've got a question about what's going on in Moldova.
Yes, I am.
You had indicated that for those of you who speak out against communism, they're being labeled as fascists. How do you bring a balance? How do you come to an equilibrium to really talk in terms of what is in the best interest of the people for their intellectual growth, for their political freedom and expressions? How do you bring that dialogue about?
The question is not, thank you for the question, which is very well, but the problem itself, I think it's very difficult and sensitive, and just through the education, just through opening the topics and trying to discuss about these sensitive issues, which during the Soviet time was prohibited and was supported and promote just Soviet ideology. And some of people, not just old people, even the young generation are trying to say, my parents or my grandmother said that it was much better. So that's why we have to follow. But also, as I mentioned, the propaganda, which still trying to demonstrate that the Soviet time was the happy time for everyone. And they're believing through this domination discourse of the pro-Russian or pro-Soviet, and not trying to have an open-minded and critical approach and try to understand positive and negative aspects of the Soviet regime, and also try to understand the monuments from the Soviet time. Most of them are ideological, but most of them are part of our history, because anyway, if they were developed by the Soviet authorities, it was on our area, on our territories, in the middle of our cities, and that's why it became part of the history of the daily life of our parents and grandparents. That's why we have to be very careful and to try to treat this recent past as much as possible from the historical approach. So this is our history. We have to deal this kind of history. It's impossible to raise these pages from our recent past. We have to preserve and to replace from the main area to the museums and to talk them about the past and to try to learn from this past, but also to try to open the box and to discuss from different perspectives, the regime, the totalitarian regime, but also the Soviet life, and to try to understand that it was, at the beginning especially, it was very specific one. The waves of deportations, terror, a lot of victims, they just killed the people, and we have to talk about. During the Soviet time, it was prohibited, and it was just in light and very positive. So now we have to open the discussions and to try to analyze from all possible perspectives, including unpleasant topics which are related to the victims and to the participants who support the regime, who try to deport the people from one area to another one, like the Holocaust issues, which also is part of our history. I didn't mention about the Holocaust or also the monuments of commemoration victims, which is another part of our history, and also sensitive issue about the monuments. We have some also attacks of such monuments. So Moldovan society, it's small one, but very specific, and in some cases very difficult in relation with the monuments and the past.
Thank you very much for that comment. Sergio, are you there?
Yeah.
I have a question for you. You know, most oppressed and exploited people, well, let me put it this way. The process of exploiting people in regions are born out of economic activities by colonial powers. And I would say that happened in Latin America, in South America, in Central America, and places like that. How do people take control of their natural resources? Because that becomes a symbol of oppression when you don't control your own resources and determine how you utilize those resources for the benefit of those individuals being oppressed. Can you speak on that, the economic component of oppression in and of itself?
I think the question is to Leo or to Alpha?
Sergio.
No?
Sergio Musteaţă. I'm sorry, Sergio. I meant Leonardo.
Say my opinion, but I think it's a little bit different.
Right. I meant Leonardo.
Yeah. Please, Leo.
William, could you repeat the question, please?
Most oppressed people are part of the process of colonialization. The exploitation of the natural resources in a region. You had colonial powers come in for an economic reason to dominate that. How important is it for indigenous people to take control of their own natural resources for their own benefit? And is that still a problem in places like South America and Central America and Latin America in general?
Yes, it's a major problem in Latin America. In Brazil, for instance, we have had reserves, for the indigenous people for a long time. Now, there's a big battle, on the borders of these reserves, because the government wants to allow, the natural resources that are there to be explored. And our native people, they have a very, how can I say, harmonic way of living in the forest. They don't explore, the natural resources as we do. They live together in harmony in the forest. So when our government is proposing, to explore these resources in a very capitalistic way, in a certain way, they are trying to destroy, the environment and the cultural environment of these groups. So it's a very, very dangerous situation that we're living now. So it's very important for us, to maintain some laws. It's not only the case in Brazil. We see that all over, Latin America, regarding the lands of the native people. They are the battle on the memory and the battle on the culture is also the battle for the land for these people. They come together. These two questions.
My next question goes to Alpha. Alpha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
You talked about the oppressed and the oppressor, and oftentimes they switch roles at some point in time, or the oppressed become oppressors. In the case of the diaspora of Africans who were brought to the Americas for slave trade, many of those individuals were captured due to conflict between African people. And then the Europeans came in to capitalize on that from an economic standpoint. How do you resolve that particular issue from being an oppressed people, but also being an oppressor? How do you create the dialogue to reconcile that as part of our history?
Okay, merci. This is a very important question, but I will reply in French. Sorry, because my English is not good. So, okay, je vais répondre en français. Et ça, c'est une question très importante et je la comprends pertinemment parce qu'elle a été posée sous différents angles. Et il est reproché à certains tenants du pouvoir en Afrique d'avoir capturé leurs frères africains et de les avoir vendus à des Occidentaux. Il faut juste rappeler le contexte. Dans le contexte africain de l'époque, à l'époque, historiquement parlant, l'esclavage existait. Et il faut que je sois honnête pour dire qu'encore dans certaines régions de l'Afrique, l'esclavage existe malheureusement sous d'autres formes. Peut-être pas sous la forme dramatique qu'on a connue dans le passé, mais elle existe encore. Malgré que dans nos pays, on a dit que les hommes naissent en droit et en devoir. Mais dans la pratique, cela n'est pas vrai. Cela n'est pas vrai. Et on se rend compte qu'il y a des formes modernes d'esclavage. Mais je ne veux pas me disculper. Ce phénomène a été surmonté dans certaines régions de l'Afrique à travers l'évolution même de la société, à travers les relations que ces communautés ont eues avec d'autres communautés à l'extérieur. Et moi, je me souviens, par exemple, quand on parle du cas des Noirs qui sont partis en Amérique contre leur volonté, contre leur gré, il y a maintenant une partie de la diaspora qui est revenue en Afrique, sous différentes formes, dans différents pays. Et j'en ai rencontré au Bénin, par exemple, des Africains qui sont revenus du Brésil ou qui sont revenus de Haïti, qui se sont installés et qui ont essayé de recouvrer leur identité. Ils ont essayé de recouvrer leur identité antérieure en se donnant des noms africains et en se convertissant à de nouvelles religions. Et ça, c'est juste pour l'histoire. Mais je veux dire que pour surmonter ce problème, parce que ça a été fait, et ça, je voulais profiter aussi pour dire que c'est la même chose que pour les monuments en Union soviétique, ex-Union soviétique, comme Sergiu l'a dit, ça fait partie de notre histoire. Qu'elle plaise ou qu'elle ne plaise pas, ça fait partie de l'histoire du continent africain, du peuple africain, qui à un moment donné, une partie des Africains a vendu une partie d'Africains à d'autres peuples. Ça, c'est une réalité. Que ce n'est pas seulement d'ailleurs aux Occidentaux, mais même à certains pays arabes. Certains pays arabes. On n'en parle pas beaucoup, mais l'esclavage n'a pas concerné que le commerce transatlantique. Il y a eu aussi l'esclavage entre l'Afrique et les pays arabes, notamment quand on prend l'Afrique de l'Est, Zanzibar et puis tous ces pays, il y a beaucoup de commerce dans ce sens. Mais je pense que c'est l'évolution même de la société, l'évolution même de l'humanité qui fait qu'on abolit l'esclavage et que les anciens oppresseurs et les anciens oppressés parviennent à discuter. Je vais juste donner un exemple de cette évolution. Quand on part en Europe, dans certains anciens pays de colons, je prends par exemple l'exemple du Portugal. Quand tu pars au Portugal, tu te rends compte qu'il y a beaucoup d'Africains, disons de Noirs, je ne sais pas s'ils sont toujours Africains ou s'ils sont Européens maintenant, en tout cas, tu te rends compte qu'il y a beaucoup de Noirs et qui, à un certain moment, ils se sentent portugais. Ils ne se sentent pas africains. Malgré que leur culture, il l'est toujours conservée. Comme au Brésil, par exemple, avec le vaudou, les pratiques anciennes qui étaient là, qu'on a transférées aussi là-bas. Donc, il y a beaucoup de thèmes qu'on peut aborder à travers l'histoire, l'évolution, l'immigration. Parce que l'esclavage aussi, c'est un aspect de l'immigration. Et en immigrant, on va avec sa culture, on va avec ses connaissances. Il n'y a pas que le corps physique qui se déplace. Il y a aussi l'intellect, il y a le spirituel. Et il y a les pratiques culturelles qui se déplacent avec l'homme, l'humain. Et moi, je pense que d'une manière générale, on se retrouve tous dans cette entité qui est l'homme, l'humain.
So I hesitate to do this because this is such an important and fascinating and interesting conversation that we're having here. But looking at the schedule, I think we're running over. And I think no, that's not, I quite understand. And, you know, it seems to me that there's a lot more to say about this. There are many, many conversations that could be held. We need to go over the recommendations right now. It occurs to me that, you know, had we had this conversation, I don't know, before, the recommendations might be a little bit different. Or so there may be a way, you know, to harness the interest and the energies that are so obvious in this conversation moving forward. And perhaps we can all think about that in terms of what regional committees can do, what national committees can do. There's got to be a way forward.